بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد فإن أحسن الكلام كلام الله وخير الهدى هدى محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وإن شر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. Today inshallah ta'ala we hope to complete the section on the third aspect of Tawheed, Tawheed al-Asma'i wa Sifat, the Tawheed which relates to Allah's names and His attributes. And in the previous lesson what the sheikhs did was just to give some examples of Allah's names and attributes found in the Quran and in the Sunnah. And so from them they mentioned Al-Hayy, Al-Qayyum, Allah is ever living. Allah is Al-Qayyum, meaning the self-sustainer who sustains everything besides Him. We also mentioned Al-Hamid, the praiseworthy, the all praiseworthy. Ar-Rahman, the one who is filled with mercy, full of mercy. Ar-Rahim, the one who is merciful to his slaves. Al-Halim, the one who is forbearing. So these are some of the names by way of example only. And from the attributes of Allah we looked at Qudra, Allah's power, Al-Hayah, Al-Hayat, which is Allah's life, Al-Ilm, which is knowledge, Al-Irada, which is Allah's wish, and Al-Ulu, which is Allah's aboveness or highness above the creation, Al-Istiwa, which is Allah ascending above the throne. Likewise Al-Kalam, Allah's speech, Al-Wajh, which is Allah's face, Allah's two hands, likewise two eyes. And we mentioned the proofs for that from the book and the Sunnah, and we spoke about some issues connected to them. But some of that inshallah ta'ala we will hope to elaborate upon a bit further in today's lesson. And in today's lesson what the sheikhs do is they present some qawaid, some rules, some principles. There are 4 of them in total. And there are 4 principles. And after those four principles, then the sheikhs mention some of the benefits and the fruits of this particular knowledge, meaning this knowledge of Allah's names and His attributes, and how it affects a person's iman, how it benefits a person's iman. So we will look at those points. There are 10 of them in total. So inshallah ta'ala that will be the structure for this lesson. So we begin, first of all, they have a section, the third section, principles, qawaid, fi bab al-asma'i wa sifat, which are principles regarding the topic of the names and the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the first one, al-qa'idatul ula, the first principle is al-qawlu fi sifat, al-qawlu fi dhat. The first principle is that speaking about the attributes, when we speak about Allah's attributes, this is just like speaking about Allah's essence. Allah's essence. And so, in fact, before we go into this principle and also the second principle, I'll mention to you the second principle now. The second principle is al-qawlu fi ba'di sifat, al-qawlu fi ba'diha al-akhir. That to speak about some of the attributes is like speaking about other attributes. So we have here 2 principles. The first one says that speaking about Allah's attributes is the same as speaking about Allah's essence. And the second principle is that to speak about some of Allah's attributes is the same as speaking about others. The principle about Allah's attributes is all the same. But before we go into these 2 principles, we need to provide some background so we can understand why these principles have been mentioned by Ahlul Sunnah. And these are mentioned by the likes of Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah and Imam Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah when they were refuting the innovators in the time. But we need to understand why is it that these principles have been mentioned and which groups of people are they referring to? Who are they being addressed to? So to do that we should remember that when it comes to Allah's names and attributes, we should remember that there are basically, we're speaking here of those who deny Allah's names and attributes. So first of all, those who deny Allah's names and attributes, we have an umbrella term for them. There is one term which is an umbrella term, and we refer to them as the Mu'attila. The Mu'attila. So first of all, we're speaking about a broad group called the Mu'attila. The Mu'attila, it means those who deny Allah's names and attributes. From the Mu'attila, we can categorize them into, or we can split them into, by their names, let's say 5 groups. There are 5 groups. First of all, they are the Jahmiyyah. Second, the Mu'tazila. So it might be worthwhile to write these names down. The Mu'tazila. So first of all, the Jahmiyyah. Secondly, the Mu'tazila. Thirdly, the Kullabiyya. Fourthly, the Ash'ariyya. And fifthly, the Maturidiyya. The 5 groups. The Jahmiyyah, Mu'tazila, Kullabiyya, Ash'ariyya, and Maturidiyya. Okay. Now each of these groups, they have different degrees of ta'til. If you remember from the previous lesson, we said ta'til is to deny Allah's names and attributes. Ta'til literally means denial, to strip someone of something. This is ta'til. It means to vacate or to empty or to strip something or someone of something. Here it means, ta'til means, in this particular field, it means to deny Allah's names and attributes, to strip Him of His names and attributes. So each of these 5 groups, there are, I've put them in the right order. So we have the Jahmiyyah, Mu'tazila, the Kullabiyya, the Ash'ariyya, and Maturidiyya. They all have a different degree and a different level of denying Allah's names and attributes. Right? So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the extent of denial found with each group. Right? So we're going to look at 3 things: Allah's names, attributes, and His actions. Right? Allah has names, Allah has attributes, and Allah has actions. Allah performs actions. He has actions. So let's look. So we're going to go through each of these 5 groups and see to what extent they deny these affairs for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the first group, they are the Jahmiyyah. They are the followers of Al-Jahm bin Safwan. And he was an astray innovator. He was actually executed by one of the leaders of the time around 128 Hijrah roughly. And so this man and the people who followed him, called the Jahmiyyah, they claimed that Allah is not described with anything. We cannot describe with anything at all, because if we did, if we ascribe to Allah a name or an attribute or an action, then it would mean that we have now treated Him like all the things that we find in the creation, because all things in the creation have names, attributes, or actions. So with this false reasoning, they claimed that from Tawheed, that Tawheed is to deny all of Allah's names, attributes, and actions. So they made Tawheed the opposite of what the messengers called to. The messengers came and they established Allah's names and His attributes, and likewise His actions. And so these people, they twisted it the other way around, and they claimed that Tawheed is to deny all of Allah's names and attributes. Okay, so basically the Jahmiyyah deny everything. They affirm Allah exists, but they deny names, attributes, and actions, and they consider this to be Tawheed. So these people obviously are the greatest in their ta'til. They are the greatest in their denial. The second group are the Mu'tazila. And the Mu'tazila, they basically inherited and took this deviation from the Jahmiyyah, from the first group. But what they did is that they said, or they claimed, to affirm Allah's names. Because they knew that how can you deny something that's so plain and obvious in the Quran? We have Allah mentioning names. How can you deny names for Allah? But really, the reason why what they said was that we affirm Allah's names, that Allah is living, Allah is Al-Hayy, Allah is Al-Qadir, but they denied the attributes. Right? So they said Allah is Al-Qadir, but without Qudra. Right? That He is all powerful but without the attribute of power. He is ever living but without the attribute of life. He is all knowing but without the attribute of knowledge. Right? These attributes don't exist, but the names exist. Right? Remember, this is all they really were doing was playing games. Playing games. And so the Mu'tazila, they affirm the names, outwardly at least, but they deny the attributes and they deny the actions. Right? So they deny Allah has attributes, separate attributes, which are knowledge, power, life, will, hearing, seeing. They deny these attributes. And likewise, they deny that Allah performs actions. Actions like Allah, for example, He ascended above the throne. This is an action of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Or that Allah, He shows mercy to His servants. This is an action of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Or that Allah is pleased with His servants. An action of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, the Mu'tazila, they affirm the names, but they deny the attributes and the actions. Okay, so this is now the Mu'tazila. So we can see that their ta'til is still great, even though if it's not as great as the ta'til of the Jahmiyyah. Now we come to the third group, and they are the Kullabiyya, and they are the followers of Ibn Kullab, and they no longer exist now. But what Ibn Kullab did was that he initially was a person upon the Sunnah, and he intended to debate these two groups, the first two groups. He wanted to debate them and argue with them and try to refute them. But when he tried to refute them, he didn't stick to the Quran and the Sunnah. Rather, he tried to use the same tools that those people were using, that those groups were using, in order to refute them. And this is a mistake. And so because of that, he himself fell into a mistake. Right? Because and what was his mistake? His mistake was that he began to deny the actions of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So even though he affirmed the names and he affirmed the attributes, he denied the actions of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He denied that Allah could perform actions, that Allah could choose to perform actions. This means, for example, that he denied that Allah chooses to speak as and when He wills. This was not acceptable to him. Allah speaking as and when He wills. Allah ascending above His throne after creating the heavens and the earth. This was not acceptable to him. Why? Because this would imply, as we mentioned in the previous lesson, that this was like an event taking place. And because of the false principles they were upon, the logic and the philosophy and the ilm al-kalam, then they claim that this would make Allah to be a body like all of the bodies that we have in the creation. So anyway, the point being here that Ibn Kullab, he tried to refute the Jahmiyyah and the Mu'tazila, but upon the wrong platform, and as a result he himself fell into deviation, and that deviation was that he denied Allah's actions, that Allah has actions tied to His will and His choice, that Allah can choose to do actions as and when He wills. Right? That Allah chose to speak to Musa alayhi salam when He spoke to him. That Allah chose to ascend above the throne. Right? That Allah, so this aspect of Allah choosing and performing actions was not acceptable to him. But he accepted that Allah has names and attributes, that Allah is above the throne, that Allah has a face, Allah has hands. He accepted all that. So now we have the third level. This is the Kullabiyya, the followers of Ibn Kullab, and they were present in the time of Imam Ahmad. The time of Imam Ahmad in the 3rd century after Hijrah. Okay, now we come to the Ash'aris. And the Ash'aris, you know that they are one of the most prominent groups present today, the Ash'aris and the Maturidis. Now the Ash'aris, they came, Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari, in fact, he came along, and what he did was that he was following the way of Ibn Kullab. So really he was a Kullabi. Right? He was following the way of Ibn Kullab. However, when the followers of Ash'ari came afterwards, they actually reverted back to the beliefs of the Mu'tazila and the Jahmiyyah in many issues. So they went astray from what Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari himself was upon. So they are the Ash'aris. And what these groups are upon, what they hold, is that we believe in some attributes, but not others. So they believed in 7 attributes. They said Allah has life, He has will, He has power, He has knowledge, He has seeing, He has hearing, and He has speech. And so they affirmed 7 attributes for Allah. But all the other attributes, mercy, rahmah, wisdom, hikmah, anger, ghadab, pleasure, rida, they didn't accept these attributes. So they accepted some, but they didn't accept other attributes. Likewise, Allah's face, Allah's ulu, Allah is above the 7 heavens. So they accepted some and they denied others. They accepted some and denied others. So this was the Ash'ariyah, that's the 4th group. And the 5th group, the Maturidiyah, really, to be honest, they're more or less basically the same. There's not any significant difference that needs to be pointed out, at this particular point. So the Ash'aris and the Maturidis, they are pretty much close together. So from this we see that there's a change and a degree of how much they denied Allah's attributes. So we have something at one end which is extreme ta'til, denial of everything from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And at the other end we have the Ash'aris and Maturidis who affirm Allah's names. They affirm some of His attributes, but they deny Allah's actions, in the sense that Allah has actions He chooses to perform. Right? And so this is where they went to. So now that we understand these 5 groups, so always remember these 5 groups: Jahmiyyah, Mu'tazila, the Kullabiyya, Ash'ariyya, and the Maturidiyya. And so now when we come to look at these 2 principles that I mentioned at the beginning, we will now understand who are they being addressed to. Who are we speaking about? And who are we referring to when we speak of these 2 principles? So the first principle then is that speaking about the attributes is just like speaking about the essence. So this means, the explanation of this principle is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there is nothing which is like Allah, neither in His essence, meaning in His self, in His being, in His essence, and nor in His names, and nor in His attributes, and nor in His actions. There's nothing to resemble Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so because of this, because we know that Allah exists, Allah indeed He exists, He's not just something that exists like an idea in the mind, He exists in reality. And that He has an essence meaning that a being, that He has a self and a being, that He actually has a real existence. And that just like we believe that Allah has attributes, we believe Allah has an essence as well. And just like we believe that Allah's attributes do not resemble anything, likewise Allah's essence does not resemble anything. Right? Allah's essence, Allah's dhat, does not resemble anything that we know. Does not resemble anything that we know. And so just like we believe that Allah Himself exists, it is a true and real existence, then likewise His attributes follow on from that. Right? The attributes follow on from that. And so likewise Allah's attributes, we affirm them, we believe in them, He has attributes, but we just don't know how they are and what the reality of those attributes are. And so who are we refuting with this principle? We are refuting those people, the Jahmiyyah, and we are refuting the Mu'tazila, because these groups say Allah has no attributes. Right? They say Allah has no attributes, but at the same time they believe Allah exists. So our argument to them is that if you believe Allah exists, Allah has an essence, Allah has a self and a being, Allah has a true existence, if you can accept that, then why can't you accept that Allah has attributes? Because then we can argue against you and say that if you affirm that Allah exists, and you affirm that Allah has a self, Allah has a dhat, then you've likened Him to the creation. Because everything else in the creation has an essence, has a being and has a self. So in other words, this refutes their argument. It shows that they are contradictory, because if they are able to accept that Allah exists, He has an essence, but His essence does not resemble the creation, then why can't you accept also that Allah has attributes which don't resemble the creation? Right? So this follows on from their acceptance that Allah does exist, He has a true and real existence. His existence, He has an essence, which is a true, real existence, not just like an idea in the mind. Allah actually exists. And so this is the argument against them. And so now, this is how the scholars argued against the Mu'tazila and showed the contradiction in their position, and said that, if you can accept Allah has an essence, and then you say at the same time it doesn't resemble anything in the creation, then why can't you accept that Allah has attributes which do not resemble anything in the creation? So then the Shaykh said that if someone was to say that I don't accept any attributes for Allah, because if I was to accept attributes for Allah, it would mean resembling Allah with the with the creation. So this means that the argument is that if we say Allah is living, Allah is hearing, Allah is seeing, Allah speaks, Allah has a wish, then we've now likened Him to the creation. Because in the creation we see that mankind is hearing, seeing, living, he has a will, he has a wish, and so on and so forth. So again, this argument is false. And the way we reply back to them is that likewise, if you accept Allah has an essence of that, meaning that He has a being and a self, then likewise everything in the creation has a being, has an essence. I mean, an essence. This has an essence. The bottle has an essence. I have an essence. Right. So now you've likened Allah to the creation, and they say no. But we believe in Allah's essence that it doesn't resemble anything. So now, if you are able to say this about Allah's essence, then likewise you can say the same thing about Allah's attributes. Because if you can accept Allah has an essence that doesn't resemble the creation, then likewise you can accept Allah has attributes that do not resemble the creation. And so this is the argument against these people, and that's why the scholars have mentioned this principle that when you speak about Allah's attributes, it is exactly the same as speaking about the essence. Right? This is because, to give you an example, that when you speak about the attributes of something, it always follows on from the actual thing itself. So we can speak about things, we can speak about this bottle, we can speak about this carpet, we can speak about this phone, we can speak about everything we see. We can see that it's made of a certain essence, and that essence is what gives it its qualities and attributes. And so likewise, we can say the same thing about the soul. Remember, we gave this example in a previous lesson. We said the soul is something which Allah has created. What is it made of? We don't know. But the soul has an essence. The soul has a true and real existence. At the same time, the soul has certain attributes. The soul can speak. The soul can see. The soul can hear. The soul even has a smell when it's carried into the heavens. A nice smell for a righteous person, a horrible smell for the wretched person. But we don't know what the soul is actually. We don't know what it's made of. We don't know what its essence is like. But at the same time, even though we don't know what its essence is like, there are attributes established for the soul. So if we can accept that for a created thing, that, for example, something can have an essence whose reality we do not know at all, and it can have attributes as well, and we don't know how those attributes are and how they exist in that thing, in that soul. If this we can accept for a created thing, then how much more so for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that we affirm for Him an essence, a being and a self, which is unlike all of the other essences. And likewise that He has attributes which are perfect attributes, which are unlike the attributes that we have in the creation. So in other words, we can accept this between a human with a body who is living and the soul on its own. Right? We don't know anything about the soul, we don't know what its essence is like, we don't know how its attributes are, but we can accept that it can accept these different attributes. So this is the argument against those who deny Allah's attributes. Right? This is why this principle is there. The second principle then is that we mentioned is that speaking about some of Allah's attributes is like speaking about other attributes, meaning that all of the attributes have a uniform principle, have the same principle. You can't distinguish between some and distinguish between others. Why? Because the origin for all of them is the same. They all have come and have been mentioned in the Quran and the Sunnah. So how can you distinguish between some and others? You have no basis. So this principle, who are we addressing? Who are the people we are speaking about? We are speaking about who? The Ash'aris and the Maturidis. Right? So in other words, remember the first two groups denied the attributes altogether. Right? So we have a different argument towards them, which is the first principle. The other groups, the Kullabiyya, or the Ash'ariyya and the Maturidiyya, they accept some of the attributes but deny others. Right? So they accept 7 attributes, and then they have some others that they differ amongst themselves. But they affirm 7 attributes, and then they say we deny other attributes. So they say Allah is living, Allah is hearing, Allah is seeing, Allah has a wish, Allah has irada, Allah has speech, Allah has speech, and so Allah has qudra, Allah has power. So they affirm 7. Allah has knowledge, will, knowledge, which is ilm. So these are 7 attributes, and then they say, as for everything else, we don't accept any of the attributes. So the question now is, how have you managed to affirm some attributes, but you didn't accept other attributes? What's the reason, and what's the basis why you can't accept other attributes? Because in the Quran and the Sunnah we see everything is the same. If Allah mentions He becomes pleased, or He becomes angry, or He has a face, then this is in the book and the Sunnah. So we affirm all of it without distinction, without without separating between some and the others. So why have you now distinguished? What's the basis of that? So this is why this principle is mentioned by the scholars, which is that speaking about some of the attributes is like speaking about all the other attributes. So the argument now then is, they say for example, that if we accept for Allah that He becomes angry, that He becomes pleased, and that He loves, for example, then this would mean that we have resembled Him to the creation, because these are human qualities, these are human deficiencies, and these are defects. We can't ascribe to Allah that He loves, or that He becomes pleased, or He becomes angry. And so the answer is, well, what's the difference between love and anger and pleasure, and between hearing and seeing and wishing? What's the difference? Because what's the difference? What's the difference between the two? So why have you managed to accept that Allah hears and sees, and that He has a wish, irada? How come you've accepted that, but then you can't accept the other ones? And then they will say, well, that's because Allah's hearing and seeing and irada is not like ours. It's not like ours. There's no resemblance or likeness between these attributes we accept and between what we find in the creation. So now that is turned back upon them, and we say, well, in that case, why can't you simply just say the same thing about Allah's love, Allah's pleasure, Allah's anger? Why can't you just say that likewise Allah, He becomes angry, but His anger is not like ours. He becomes pleased, but His pleasure is not like ours. And likewise He loves, but His love is not like ours. Why can't you say the same thing and be consistent? And then so we see here that this is where the argument breaks down, and they can't really distinguish between one or the other. They don't have any sound principle. What's the principle by which you are distinguishing between one set of attributes and the other set of attributes? So anyway, this is what we say. This is what we say about those who differentiate between some attributes and others, that the argument is false and it is contradictory when they affirm some and they reject others. So this is the second principle mentioned by the sheikhs. And then the third principle they mention is that the names and attributes are what we call tawqifiyya. Tawqifiyya. Al-asma' wa sifat tawqifiyya. This means that our speech about Allah's names and attributes are restricted to the revelation. The word tawqifiyya literally means to be suspended. And what it means is that we cannot speak about Allah's names or attributes except with a text. It is limited. It is restricted. We can only speak on the basis of a text. And what this means here, what this is in refutation of, is, again, it's in refutation of these people and also the philosophers. These are people who claim that knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, knowledge of the Creator, is something that is arrived at by the intellect, by the aql, by reason. Right? So when we say, when we use this principle that the names and attributes of Allah are tawqifiyya, meaning that they are restricted to revelation, we are here refuting and opposing and rejecting against the philosophers, and likewise the Jahmiyyah and the Mu'tazila. And what we mean here is that if you look at some of these philosophers in history like Aristotle and Plato, and these are the Greek philosophers, and when they tried to speak about the Creator, they were just using reason and intellect, that that the Creator is such and such and such and such and such and such, and they were all using it. It wasn't from revelation, because they denied revelation in principle, but they spoke on the basis of reason. And so what we are doing here with this principle is that we are refuting all those people, not just the philosophers, but also the Jahmiyyah and the Mu'tazila and even the Ash'aris as well, because all of them are united upon a principle which is, they are all united upon a principle which is that if the Quran and Sunnah conflict, oppose reason, then it is reason that comes first. Right? This is a principle that all these groups that I mentioned to you at the beginning, that all of them are upon this. Jahmiyyah, Mu'tazila, not so much the Kullabi, but the Ash'aris and the Maturidis. That if reason and revelation conflict, that we give precedence to the reason, and the revelation is secondary. This is a principle that all of them are upon. So this principle here, al-asma' wa sifat tawqifiyya, that the names and attributes are restricted to a text, meaning that we only speak, knowledge of Allah's names and attributes only comes from the revelation. This invalidates that principle, right? That the aql, that the intellect can by itself arrive at knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This doesn't mean to say that with reason we can learn about some of Allah's attributes, because this is possible. We can use the aql, and through it we can arrive at some knowledge of Allah. Like for example, we know that Allah must be living. This is something from reason that we can work out. Allah is living. And we know that Allah must have a will, Allah must have knowledge, Allah must have qudra. These are 4 examples that can very easily be determined just by reason, that Allah has will, knowledge, qudra and life. And then the other things we can work out as well, that Allah must have mercy, Allah must have love, Allah must have anger. These things which we work out when we look and reflect in the creation. But this is only limited as to what we can arrive at with the intellect. We can only arrive at a limited type of knowledge about Allah. As for the detailed knowledge, it only comes in the Quran and the Sunnah. So therefore we put aql, we put reason in its proper place. We put it in its proper place, which is that the aql is something that Allah has bestowed upon mankind as a means, as an instrument by which they can understand and reflect, and by way of it they can reflect upon what the messengers and what is revealed in the books, and from that they understand and they acquire knowledge about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And with respect to the matters of the unseen, which cannot be seen, then the aql cannot be an independent source of knowledge for that. The aql has to be subservient, has to follow the revelation, the book and the sunnah. This is how we put, even though aql, even though reason in and of itself can sometimes acquire some limited type of knowledge about Allah and about some of His attributes. So we don't deny that, but we put reason, aql, in its proper place and in its proper context. Whereas what these groups did is that they put aql up here and they put revelation down here. And then on account of that they went astray in Allah's names and attributes, and they began to deny Allah's names and attributes. So this principle is that the names and attributes of Allah are tawqifiyya, and so the reason has no place in this subject at all, in terms of what Allah deserves of names and attributes. And the proof for this is in the Quran. From the verses which are a proof is the saying of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Al-Isra, Surah 17, verse 36, وَلَا تَقْفُ مَا لَيْسَ لَكَ بِهِ عِلْمٍ إِنَّ السَّمْعَ وَالْبَصَرَ وَالْفُؤَادَ كُلُّ أُولَٰئِكَ كَانَ عَنْهُ مَسْئُولًا. That indeed, that do not pursue that of which you have no knowledge. For indeed, the hearing, the seeing, and the heart, or the senses, the feeling, all of that will be inquired into, will be investigated. So in other words, don't pursue that which you have no knowledge. And we see that all of the scholars of Islam, like Imam Ahmad, they were upon this way, they were upon this methodology. Imam Ahmad, rahimahullah, he said, لا يوصف الله إلا بما وصف به نفسه أو وصف به رسوله لا يتجاوز القرآن والحديث. He said that Allah is not to be described except what He Himself described Himself, or what His Messenger described Him with. The Quran and Hadith are not to be surpassed. We don't go past the Quran and the Hadith. And likewise, the Sheikhs explain that some of the people of knowledge, they have clarified that knowledge about anything can only be acquired in one of three ways. There's only three ways in which you can acquire knowledge. First is that you see something directly yourself. So you see something, and so from that you've acquired direct knowledge. You're able to now describe it, you can explain it, you can describe it, so now you can explain how it is. Or, if you haven't seen that thing directly, you've seen something which is like it. You've seen a mathil, or mithal. So now you see a likeness of that thing. Right? So now you can describe, that original thing on account of a likeness you have seen of it. And the third way is that someone else describes it to you. Someone else has knowledge and they describe it to you. There's only these three ways. Either you see it yourself, or you see something which is like it, or someone has brought you knowledge regarding it. Right? So here they say that the knowledge of Allah's names and attributes is limited to the third one. Why? Because it is the messengers who come with revelation, and it is the messengers who are the most knowledgeable of Allah after Allah Himself. Allah is the most knowledgeable of Himself. Then the messengers are the most knowledgeable of Allah, and the Messenger Muhammad is the most knowledgeable of Allah in the creation. So then the knowledge is brought to us in this manner, and this is from revelation, and so it is obligatory that we stick to the way of revelation when it comes to speaking about Allah's names and attributes, because nobody has seen Allah. No one has seen Allah such that they can now describe His names and speak of His attributes. No one has seen Allah. Allah does not have any likeness either, such that it can be seen, such that from that we can gain knowledge of Allah. No. Rather, the only way is the third way, by way of the messengers and the revealed books. So this is the third principle then. So remember, what we're doing with each of these principles is that they are a refutation of these groups in different ways. Right? So we need to know the significance of these principles and why they are being mentioned. The fourth principle then is Asma'ullah kulluha husna. That the names of Allah, all of them are beautiful. All of them are beautiful. And what this means is that all of the names of Allah reach the extremity of perfection and beauty. As in that the names, the meanings that the names convey, that they reach the extremity of beauty and perfection. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلِلَّهِ الْأَسْمَاءُ الْحُسْنَى. To Allah belong the most beautiful names. Surah A'raf, Surah 7, verse 180. And what this means is that when we reflect upon Allah's names, we see that they point to the most beautiful of meanings. Most beautiful of meanings. And the most complete and perfect of meanings. And the most noble and lofty of meanings. This is what every name of Allah, what it contains. Why? Because every name of Allah points to an attribute. It indicates an attribute. And this attribute is such that it does not have any deficiency whatsoever. It doesn't have any deficiency whatsoever in it at all, in any form. Then there are some examples. First example is Al-Hayy, is one of Allah's names. Al-Hayy, it means, it is the name Al-Hayy, ever living, and it points to Allah's complete and perfect life. Life which was not preceded by non-existence, and nor will it be preceded by non-existence, nor will it be followed by non-existence. Meaning Allah's life is complete and perfect. It never had a beginning, nor will it have an end. It wasn't non-existent, nor will it ever end. This is what we call perfect life, complete life in every respect. And as for our life, we know it's deficient. We were dead, then we were given life, then we will die again, then we'll be brought back to life. And it will be either eternal bliss or eternal punishment. So, as for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His life is perfect life. Doesn't have any beginning, nor will it have any end, nor will it cease. So it has the most complete meaning of life. And likewise, this life of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala itself is something that necessitates other qualities. Like, for example, Allah's knowledge, Allah's ilm, and Allah's qudra, Allah's power, and Allah's hearing and seeing. All of these are from Allah's perfect life. And in each of these attributes, Allah's ilm, Allah's qudra, Allah's hearing, Allah's seeing, we see all of them are complete and perfect in every single respect. As an example, Allah's knowledge, Allah is Al-Alim, Allah is Al-Alim. And so we see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has perfect knowledge in the sense that nothing that He knows was preceded by ignorance. So it wasn't the case that Allah did not know something, then He knew something. This is why, for example, we do not describe Allah with ma'rifah. Allah does not ever describe Himself with ma'rifah. Allah always uses alima, al-alim. Allah always describes ilm, because with ma'rifah, with arafa, it means to come to know something. To come to know something, to arrive at some knowledge. Whereas with ilm, alima, it just means to know. And so with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His knowledge was not preceded by ignorance. So nor will it ever end. Unlike humans, we forget. We have knowledge, then we forget. We forget. We know something 1 minute and we forget 10 minutes later. As for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we see in the Quran, when Fir'aun, when he said to Musa alayhi salam, when they were having a debate, and Musa said to him, when is the hour? And so Musa said, "Ilmuha inda Rabbi fi kitab, la yadillu Rabbi wa la yansa." So Musa said, the knowledge of it is with my Lord. Is with my Lord. It is in a book. My Lord never errs, nor does He forget. So this shows that the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is complete, perfect knowledge. Allah has complete knowledge of all of His own actions and of all the actions of the servants. Allah knows everything of His own actions that He will do, and likewise everything that His servants will do, everything which is in His creation. So Allah's knowledge is complete, all comprehensive, and perfect. And likewise we see Allah says, يَعْلَمُ خَائِنَةَ الْأَعْيُنِ وَمَا تُخْفِي الصُّدُورِ. Allah knows the deception of the eyes. Because the eyes can deceive in the sense that inwardly a person really is intending or feeling one thing, but with the eyes there's a pretense and a hypocrisy and something else. Allah knows the deception of the eyes. And likewise Allah knows وَمَا تُخْفِي الصُّدُورِ, that which the hearts conceal. Allah knows that as well. So this is something that mankind does not know. We don't know what people are concealing in the hearts or the deception of the eyes. Allah knows that. So this shows that Allah's knowledge is unlike our knowledge. It is the complete perfect knowledge. Also on top of this, we see that Allah's names and attributes are sometimes, Allah's names in fact, are sometimes mentioned in sets of twos. In the Quran, Allah mentions His names in sets of twos. And what this means is that when the name is mentioned alone, it has its own meaning obviously. When it is mentioned along with another name, then each name explains the other name. And each name adds a level of perfection on top of what the other name already has by itself. Okay? So we'll give an example of this. We see that in the Quran, Al-Aziz Al-Hamid is mentioned often. Al-Aziz Al-Hamid. This is often mentioned in the Quran. So we see that each of them mentions a specific perfection, a specific meaning, and then when it is mentioned together, then it adds another layer of perfection on top of that. So for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we see here Al-Izzah, Allah is mighty, powerful. And likewise, Al-Hikmah, wisdom. Right? These two things are mentioned together. Al-Aziz, Al-Hakim. And so Allah is Aziz in His Hikmah, and likewise He is Al-Hakim in His Izzah. Both ways. What this means is that, for example, Al-Izzah, it means might and power. And so when Allah has His might and power isn't such that it leads to oppression. Rather, Allah has hikmah in His might and power. This is unlike, for example, we see that in the kings and the leaders upon this upon this earth, that sometimes, or other than them, where they have a great amount of power, they acquire a great amount of power over the people, and so they have this izzah, but then they fall into oppression, they fall into dhulm, because they do not have hikmah in their might and their power. Right? So therefore they fall into oppression. As for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we see that His izzah, His power, is tied to His hikmah. Right? That Allah does not oppress or wrong anyone, because all of His might and His power is tied to His hikmah. That everything, there is a wisdom behind it, and there is a far-reaching wisdom behind it. And so likewise, in Allah's hikmah, in Allah's wisdom, there is might and there is power. This is unlike what we see that amongst mankind, there might be someone who has wisdom, but he has no izzah, he has no power to implement it and to force it upon the people. Whereas Allah, He has hikmah and He has the izzah, He has the might and the power. So we see here how one name adds perfection to another name, and one name explains the other name. So Al-Aziz, Al-Hakim is an example. There are many other examples which can be studied. And so when we study them, we see that when we come to study Allah's names and attributes, there are many things that we look at a name by itself, then we look at a name when it's mentioned with another one, and then we look at how and why is it that this particular name is put next to this particular name, and we see that all of this gives us more and more knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His names and His attributes and the perfection in all of that. So this brings us an end to these 4 principles. Let's go through them again. The first one was what? The first principle, that speaking about the attributes is like speaking about the essence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yes, and by this we are refuting those who deny all of Allah's attributes. Second principle was that speaking about some attributes is like what? Speaking about all the rest. Yeah. So we don't distinguish between one set and another set, because all of them, how do we come to know them? We come to know them in the Quran and the Sunnah. So how can we distinguish between one or the other? There isn't any basis for distinction. Rather, we have one principle that is consistent for everything, which is that we believe in everything Allah has revealed about Himself, or which His Messenger affirmed for Himself, without tamthil and ta'til and tahrif and ta'weel, all the other things that we mentioned before. And we affirm that there is no likeness between anything that Allah is described with and that which is in the creation. It's a uniform principle that applies to everything. And when we start distinguishing between one group and another group, we affirm Allah's knowledge, life, power and will, but we can't accept hearing and seeing. Now we fall into contradiction. Or we affirm Allah's knowledge, hearing, seeing, life, will, power, but we can't accept Allah's anger, pleasure, istiwa, love, mercy, wisdom. And we fall into contradiction, because how can you distinguish between these attributes? And the third principle is that the names and attributes of Allah are restricted to a proof, to revelation, tawqifiyya, meaning that the aql cannot be an independent proof for knowledge of Allah. Rather, speaking about Allah's names and attributes must have its origin in a revealed text. And so in other words, what we're doing by this principle is putting reason and aql into its proper place. Right? And when we don't do this, this is when all the deviations start to arise. And this is exactly why the deviations of these people came to be. Because they put the aql up here, and they put the naql, which is the revelation, down here. The transmitted revelation down here. And so as a result, they fell into denying Allah's names and attributes to different degrees. That was the third principle. And the fourth principle is that all of Allah's names are beautiful. All of the names of Allah are al-husna, they are beautiful. Which means that they reach the extreme of beauty in meaning and loftiness and perfection and so on and so forth. And we give some examples of that. Al-Hayy, Al-Alim and Al-Aziz, Al-Hakim mentioned together. There are other examples like this. Okay, now the sheikhs finish off by giving 10 benefits, from this subject area. So I'll quickly go through them, inshallah ta'ala. The first one, first of all, is that the servant, by way of these names and attributes, he acquires the happiness of this life and the hereafter. And rather, we see that happiness in this life and the next is itself directly dependent upon, is directly tied to this faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this knowledge of Allah and His names and attributes. If you remember, in the previous lesson we mentioned how that the hearts and the ibadah, the worship of the heart itself, is dependent upon the knowledge that it is filled with. And so the knowledge of Allah's names and attributes really is like the life to the heart, because this knowledge is what then creates the emotions in the heart. The emotions in the heart, like love, fear, hope, reliance. These are things which the heart has emotions. But to drive those emotions, there must be the knowledge of Allah's names and attributes. So we see really that Allah's names and attributes really are the foundation of a person's worship of Allah and his outward ibadah. And that's why, for this reason, these people who deviate in Allah's names and attributes, they are doing a great deal of damage and harm to the people's iman, because they are eroding away the basis of people's iman. So that's the first benefit, that the happiness of a servant in this life and the next, it is tied to and dependent upon acquiring this particular knowledge. And rather, we see that the extent that really that the extent of the iman, the amount of iman of a person, is directly tied to his knowledge of Allah's names and His attributes. Right? So the greater his knowledge, the greater his iman, and the greater his happiness in this life and the next. Second benefit is that a believer having faith in Allah's names and His attributes, it is the greatest means and the greatest way by which he fears his Lord, by which he has khawf of his Lord, by which he has khashya of his Lord, of awe of his Lord, and by which he is propelled to obedience to Allah, to his Lord. Okay? And so the more a servant knows his Lord, then the more he will be closer to his Lord. The more he will be firm upon his worship, and the more he will keep away from disobedience. Right? So this knowledge makes him fearful of Allah, and makes him, have awe of Allah, and makes him firm upon obedience. The third benefit is that a believer with this knowledge in his heart, he acquires tranquility. He acquires tranquility. His heart is at ease, and he feels secure in this life and the next. Why? Because it is by Allah's remembrance that the hearts find tranquility. See how Allah says in the Quran, الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَتَطْمَئِنُّ قُلُوبُهُمْ بِذِكْرِ اللَّهِ أَلَا بِذِكْرِ اللَّهِ تَطْمَئِنُّ الْقُلُوبُ. Allah says, indeed, those who believe and whose hearts find tranquility in the remembrance of Allah. Indeed, in the remembrance of Allah do the hearts find tranquility. And obviously when we remember Allah, how are we remembering Allah? We only remember Him on account of what He's told us, of His names and attributes. So this shows that a servant who knows Allah and His names and His attributes and is rooted in this knowledge, that he will be a person who is the most tranquil and at ease and at peace and feel safe and secure no matter what happens around him. Right? Because this knowledge is something that brings the safety and serenity and calmness and ease in the heart, as opposed to anxiety and stress and fear and this and so on and so forth, whatever. This knowledge really is it's the foundation of that safety and serenity. Fourth benefit is that the reward in the hereafter, all of it is tied to this iman. A person being rewarded is tied to this very faith. This faith, and having this faith and having this knowledge of Allah's names and attributes, and then acting upon what this knowledge requires. So if a person acts upon this, then he will have in the hereafter what no eye has seen, what no ear has heard of, and what has never been imagined in the heart and mind of a person. And likewise, he will be saved from the hellfire. And so all of this is, we see that this is the benefit of this knowledge. These are the effects and the fruits of this knowledge. And this is something that he will, that he will have. And obviously, from that is that he will have the great pleasure of seeing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the hereafter, looking at Allah's face. And this obviously is on top of the reward of being entered into paradise and saved from the hellfire. That's fourth benefit. Fifth benefit is that it is this faith, again, this iman in Allah in general, Allah's rububiyyah, uluhiyyah and asma wa sifat, that all of this faith is something that validates a person's actions. It makes your actions acceptable to Allah. It makes them correct and sound. Because remember, actions which are acceptable to Allah must have conditions. And those conditions are that they must be sincerely for His sake, upon tawheed, upon monotheism, seeking only Allah's face, and they must be correct. So this iman that we are speaking of, iman in Allah, His names and His attributes, and worshipping Him alone, and His rububiyyah, that this, when that is present, it validates the action, meaning it makes them acceptable to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah says, وَمَنْ يَكْفُرْ بِالْإِيمَانِ فَقَدْ حَبِطَ عَمَلُهُ وَهُوَ فِي الْآخِرَةِ مِنَ الْخَاسِرِينَ. That whoever rejects faith, rejects iman, and iman in Allah is iman in His names and attributes, iman in His uluhiyyah, and iman in His rububiyyah. So this faith is required for a person's actions to be acceptable. Likewise, Allah says, وَمَنْ أَرَادَ الْآخِرَةَ وَسَعَى لَهَا سَعْيَهَا وَهُوَ مُؤْمِنٌ فَأُولَٰئِكَ كَانَ سَعْيُهُمْ مَشْكُورًا. That whoever wishes for the hereafter and who strives for it as it should be striven for, whilst he is a believer, whilst he has iman. So he mentioned iman and he mentioned striving. So that iman in Allah, His names, His attributes, His uluhiyyah, His rububiyyah, is something upon which actions depend for their acceptance. So this is the fifth benefit, that iman is something that corrects and makes a person's actions acceptable. And it has to be the correct iman upon what we've obviously been discussing in these series of lessons. Sixth benefit is that correct action, correct iman, that iman which is sound and iman which is correct is something that keeps a servant adhering to the truth. It allows him to adhere to the truth and to continue to benefit from admonitions and from lessons. And it's something that maintains his fitrah to be sound, to keep his fitrah from being corrupt. And it makes him maintain a pure good intention and to be always desirous of good deeds and to keep away from evil things. Meaning that this cultivation, this nurturing of a person upon Allah's names and attributes, it's something that keeps him healthy and robust in these different ways. Meaning that he will always keep benefiting from admonitions. His heart will remain clean and sound. His fitrah will remain protected. He will always have a good intention, a good qasd, good niyyah, and he will always be led to good deeds. So this is the effect of the cultivation of this sound iman. It keeps him in check and keeps him in this manner. The seventh benefit that we have here is that having faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this iman in Allah is something that a believer can recourse to. He can seek refuge in. He can from all of the evils that take place, from all of the harms, the fear, the disobedience that he falls to. We see that every person, every believer, he falls into these things. He has stresses, anxieties, evils befall him, becomes sad, he starts grieving about things, he fears about things, sometimes he obeys, sometimes he disobeys, sometimes he sins, sometimes he's pious. This happens to every single person. So in all of these things that take place, he always has something to fall back upon and refer back to, which is his iman in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So for example, when nice things happen to him, when likable things happen to him, when pleasurable things happen to him, then in this situation, his iman which he is acting upon, forces him to be grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, forces him to praise Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to be grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is one scenario. Another scenario is that maybe harmful things happen to him, dislikable things happen to him. He is sad, So here again he goes back and he recourses back to his iman again in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it leads him to have patience and to accept, to anticipate reward. And so likewise we can apply to all of the situations. Maybe sometimes he is obedient to Allah, so therefore he is grateful to Allah for keeping upon istiqamah. Maybe other times he is disobedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then his iman forces him to make tawbah to Allah. And so we see that in every situation that we have, a believer, whether it is in his religious affairs or whether it is in his worldly affairs, he always recourses back to his iman in everything. And this iman is something that really is the foundation for his life and his hereafter. So it keeps him in check again. Benefit number 8 is that this knowledge of Allah, this acquaintance of Allah, is something that brings about love, mahabba of Allah in the heart. It makes a servant inherit love of Allah, and it develops that love of Allah in the hearts, because the names of Allah are such that they naturally produce love in the heart. This is because mankind, the way Allah has created mankind, and the way Allah has created the hearts, and the way Allah has created the souls, is that Allah has made them inclined to love things which have beauty and perfection. Okay, you find yourself loving something in which there is perfection and beauty and so on and so forth. This is just how Allah has created mankind. So likewise, when they learn of Allah's names and His attributes and the perfection and the beauty in meaning behind Allah's names and attributes, then without doubt, this naturally causes a heart to love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when a heart loves Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then it in turn leads the limbs, because the limbs are the soldiers and the heart is the king. And so where the king goes, the soldiers always follow. So when the heart loves Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then the limbs will follow in obedience. So this is why Allah's names and His attributes are the foundation of worship, and why this is an area that we must give the great importance to. Number 9, likewise, knowledge of Allah's names and attributes, it causes a person to inherit yaqeen, certainty, to have yaqeen, certainty in the fact that Allah is alone and singled out in controlling all of the affairs of the creation, and that there is no partner to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in anything. And so therefore the servant will not be successful except by reliance and making tawakkul upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Meaning, it makes him to have tawakkul upon Allah. He will have yaqeen first and foremost. So Allah's names and attributes cause him to have yaqeen, certainty in everything. And that certainty itself is something that brings about trust and reliance upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And finally, number 10 is that the knowledge of Allah's names and attributes is the foundation of every single knowledge in the creation. Every type of knowledge in the creation, every type of worldly knowledge, every type of knowledge, in fact, all of it emanates and arises from the knowledge of Allah's names and attributes. This is because everything in terms of knowledge is either what we call al-khalq or al-amr. Everything which can be known is either it is from the creation or it is from Allah's command. It is something Allah has created or it is something Allah has commanded. These are two things. Al-khalq wal-amr. Allah's creation or Allah's command. And so in other words, the Sharia is from Allah's command. This is what we mean, Allah's command. Whatever Allah commands is His Sharia, His commands and His prohibitions. So therefore, this is the knowledge of the Sharia. And Allah's creation is the knowledge of everything in the dunya. Everything in the creation, all the different types of sciences and knowledge and whatever else, all of that. So because Allah's names and attributes are tied to His creation and His command. Right? So Allah creates and Allah commands. Allah creates, Allah commands. then Allah's names and attributes are tied to these two things. So for example, from Allah's names you see that Allah is Al-Khaliq, the creator, Al-Razzaq, the provider, Al-Muhyi, the one who gives life, Al-Mumit, the one who takes life. All of these are names which are tied to Allah's, the creation. And likewise we see some of them are tied to Allah is Al-Hakim, Allah is wise, Allah is Allah does whatever He wills, and there are many other descriptions and attributes and names which are tied to His Sharia. The fact that Allah commands that which is beneficial for the servants, that Allah wishes mercy upon His servants, all and so on and so forth. Then we see that some of His names are tied to the Sharia. So we see from this that every single type of knowledge, all of it, whether it's worldly knowledge or Sharia knowledge, all of it comes back down to and arises from and has its basis in the knowledge of Allah's names and attributes. Right? So this is why that the one who has the most knowledge of Allah's names and attributes is the one who is the most knowledgeable of the creation and of Allah's Sharia. Right? So understand that. So this is why the point that we're getting here is that we shouldn't be deceived by thinking that just because the non-Muslims, or just because they have all the sciences and knowledge and this about the universe and this and knowledge and that and whatever, that as if they are the most knowledgeable of the creation. No, because that knowledge of the creation is more. It's not true and real knowledge from the right perspective of the creation. It's really a type of misguided type of knowledge. Even though it's knowledge, it's out of its place. It's from the wrong perspective. So despite having that knowledge, they are still blind and still ignorant. Right? So this is why that the ones who are truly knowledgeable of the creation, of Al-Khalq and Al-Amr, of the Sharia, are the ones who are the most knowledgeable of Allah's names and His attributes. And no doubt that is the prophets and messengers, and then the scholars after them. And so this is the 10th benefit, that if you want to truly have knowledge of the creation and the command, meaning the dunya, the creation and the Sharia, then you must be someone who understands and has knowledge of Allah's names and His attributes, because through that you then see everything taking place around you through Allah's names and attributes, because Allah's attributes are reflected in everything that takes place around us. And so with this is the 10th benefit. So with this we conclude today's lesson, and actually this now brings us to an end of the first pillar of Iman. So the first pillar of Iman, which is Al-Imanu Billah, we've now alhamdulillah completed the whole section, and we will now move on to the second pillar of Al-Iman, which is belief in the angels. Everything connected to the angels, inshallah ta'ala, that will be our next series of lessons. So if there's any questions on anything that's been said in today's lesson, we have a few minutes for that, inshallah. Otherwise we will conclude the lesson there, inshallah. The next lesson we will have will be in 2 weeks' time, inshallah. Yeah, 2 weeks' time. So in 2 weeks' time, inshallah, we'll start the second pillar of Iman, which is on the angels, which again is a very interesting subject. So with that we conclude today's lesson. Jazakumullahu khairan. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.